War does not always begin with a single thunderclap. Sometimes it advances quietly, through meetings behind closed doors, calculated risks, and decisions made far from the battlefield. In the winter of 1943, as the Second World War raged across continents, Allied leaders chose a new direction for the conflict, one that would pull the war deeper into Europe and reshape its outcome. The Mediterranean had become a testing ground. North Africa was secured, but victory there posed a new question: where to strike next? In January, American and British leaders gathered in Casablanca to decide the future course of the war. Their conclusion was clear. The island of Sicily, guarding the gateway to Italy itself, would become the next objective. Taking it would open the Mediterranean to Allied shipping, weaken German defenses, and place enormous pressure on Italy, already strained by years of war. When Allied forces landed in Sicily, the operation was ambitious and chaotic from the start. British troops landed in the southeast, while American forces struck the southwest coast, their mission to seize airfields and shield the broader advance. Airborne soldiers were dropped ahead of the landings, but fierce winds and navigational errors scattered them across the countryside. Yet, even in disarray, these isolated units disrupted enemy communications and added to the confusion in German defenses. The Germans responded quickly. Armored units counterattacked the American beaches within hours, threatening to push the invaders back into the sea. The situation hung in the balance until naval gunfire, infantry resistance, and hastily deployed artillery shattered the German formations. Still, the cost was high. Reinforcement drops by parachute and glider ended tragically when Allied anti-aircraft crews, mistaking friendly aircraft for enemy planes, opened fire. The losses were devastating and underscored how fragile even well-planned operations could become under pressure. As fighting spread across Sicily, German defenses slowed the British advance toward the island's eastern ports. To break the stalemate, Allied commanders redirected American forces westward, capturing Palermo and then driving east along the northern coast. There, a series of small amphibious landings allowed Allied troops to outmaneuver entrenched German positions. By mid-August, Allied forces reached Messina just as the last Axis troops escaped across the strait. Sicily had fallen, but the war was far from over. The victory carried consequences far beyond the island. In Italy, confidence in the Axis alliance began to collapse. Secret negotiations began between Italian leaders and the Allies, driven by the realization that defeat was inevitable. Germany anticipated betrayal. As Italy wavered, German troops flooded south, preparing to seize control. When Allied forces crossed into mainland Italy, they encountered a confusing and violent transition. Italian defenses dissolved almost overnight, replaced by hardened German formations determined to hold the peninsula at all costs. Landings at Salerno marked the beginning of one of the most grueling campaigns of the war. German counterattacks battered the beaches relentlessly, threatening another evacuation. Only through sustained resistance and eventual link-up between Allied forces did the landings hold. Naples fell soon after, offering a vital port, but the road north was anything but open. Italy's geography favored the defender. Mountain ridges, narrow valleys, and rivers became natural fortresses. German commanders turned the landscape itself into a weapon, constructing layered defensive lines that forced the Allies into slow, costly advances. Rivers were crossed under fire, only to face new barriers beyond. Improvised bridges were thrown across shattered terrain as engineers struggled to keep the advance moving. The fighting around Cassino became symbolic of the entire Italian campaign. Months of attacks failed to dislodge German defenders anchored in commanding high ground. An attempt to bypass these defenses with an amphibious landing farther north promised to break through,
but hesitation allowed German forces to react, turning opportunity into another siege. What was meant to be a bold maneuver became a grinding struggle, with troops pinned under constant artillery fire. Spring finally brought movement. Coordinated offensives forced German units to retreat, and Allied troops entered Rome just days before the invasion of France began. But Italy, once central, has now become secondary. Resources shifted north, leaving fewer troops to continue the slow push through the remaining German defenses. The fighting dragged on through mountains and valleys until the final surrender in the spring of 1945. Even as battles raged in Italy, a far greater operation was taking shape elsewhere. Preparations for a direct assault on German-occupied France had been underway for years. The Allies had solved one of their most dangerous problems, the German submarine threat. Secret intelligence gleaned from broken enemy codes provided critical insight into German movements, tipping the balance in the Atlantic and beyond. By early 1944, Allied air power dominated Western Europe. Bombers systematically targeted railways, bridges, and depots, isolating the future battlefield. Meanwhile, millions of men and vast quantities of equipment flowed into Britain. Entire landscapes were transformed into camps, airfields, and supply depots. Planning was meticulous, rehearsals constant. Nothing could be left to chance. The invasion plan called for landings along the coast of Normandy, far from where German commanders expected the main blow. An elaborate deception convinced them that the real invasion would strike farther east. As a result, powerful German reserves remained misplaced, waiting for an attack that would never come. Beyond Western Europe, the war on the Eastern Front reached a decisive phase. German defeats against Soviet forces shattered any hope of regaining the initiative. Entire armies were destroyed, and the German military was forced into a permanent defensive posture. These losses ensured that when the invasion of France came, Germany would lack the strength to respond decisively. In early June, weather dictated fate. A brief break in storms gave Allied leaders the narrow window they needed. Airborne troops dropped behind enemy lines in darkness, seizing bridges and roads. At dawn, Allied soldiers crossed the channel and moved ashore. Some beaches fell quickly, others became scenes of chaos and slaughter, where small units clung to survival under relentless fire. By day's end, the landings had succeeded, but only just. What followed was not a swift march inland, but a brutal struggle inside. The Norman countryside, divided by ancient hedgerows, favored the defender. Each field became a fortress. Progress was measured in yards, paid for in blood. Supplies ran low, artillery shells were rationed, and morale was tested. Yet persistence prevailed. A massive breakthrough shattered German lines, unleashing mobile forces into open country. The collapse came suddenly. German counterattacks failed, and retreat turned into disaster as Allied forces encircled entire armies. Paris was liberated, and Allied troops surged toward Germany's borders. Yet even then, the war refused to end easily. Supply shortages, weather, and stubborn resistance slowed the advance. By the time Germany finally surrendered, the path to victory had been shaped not by a single battle, but by a series of decisions, some bold, some costly, that unfolded across Sicily's beaches, Italian mountains, and the fields of Normandy. It was a war decided as much by endurance and strategy as by firepower, and its lessons would echo long after the guns fell silent.